This presentation will focus on the beginning of the Civil War and the first couple of battles. As the war began, both sides were confident that it would end very, very quickly and that they would win. The North thought the South would quickly get defeated, maybe in one or two battles, and they would give up the fight and give up this silly fight over states' rights and slavery and trying to become their own country. And the South thought the North would lose a few battles and they would just be done. They would be sick of fighting it and just give up and let the South become their own country. But obviously, both of them are wrong. And so let's talk a little bit about the two sides. The North, another nickname for it is the Union. Okay, and the North or the Union was just the United States of America. It was still the same thing. It was still called the United States of America and normal and everything like that. Okay. Now, its president was Abraham Lincoln. He was elected, and so he would be the president of the United States. The South was the different one. They were also known as the Confederacy because um, they had broken off from the United States and they had become something called the Confederate States of America. So it was all of the states that had seceded from the USA and joined the Confederate States of America. And their president was this man down here. His name is Jefferson Davis. Okay, and so at that point, at the very beginning, it was 7 states that had broken off and become their own country. So 2 days after Fort Sumter, the North and Abraham Lincoln were saying it's a rebellion, it's out of control, they're attacking us, and so it is time to fight against them and take this rebellion down. And so he asked each governor of every single state to get some troops together. He asked for 75,000 troops. Okay, men volunteered all across the North. There were tons of people running out to volunteer for this opportunity to fight in this war. And so some states like Ohio and Indiana and some others said, can we please send more than 75,000 troops? We'd like to send more. We have so many people wanting to come out and fight. However, not every state was super excited about it. They didn't want to send people to fight against the South. And so states like Tennessee, who were still part of the United States, who had not seceded, Tennessee said, we will not send a single man against our Southern brothers. Okay, and Kentucky and Missouri also said the same thing. And then Delaware and Maryland, which are even further north states, but that had not seceded, but they were still slave states, they had said, nothing at all. They just didn't respond to the request for 75,000 troops. They didn't send troops, and they also didn't say no. So that call for troops that Lincoln did right away caused a lot more secession. It caused many more states to secede. And the first one to do this happened on April 17th, and that was Virginia. And Virginia, it's in gray right here. I'll try and kind of put a yellow arrow to it. Okay, that's Virginia right there. And Virginia plus this blue part is what Virginia used to be. However, when Virginia seceded, the western part said, we will not secede. We want to be part of the country. We want to stay with them. And so that part of Virginia stayed with the Union, whereas the other part of Virginia stayed with went with the South. They seceded. And so 2 years later, those 50 counties that never did secede were admitted into the Union as a new state called West Virginia, which we still have around today. Okay, and then also 1 month later in May, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined in. And so, there were a few of the border states that were really, really important that we really needed. The North needed them on their side, the South needed them on their side, and so they kind of had to decide which way they were going to go. But the people in those states could not agree on which side. For example, in Delaware, and Delaware is one of the small states right up here. Okay, one of these that's in red. Okay, and in Delaware there were a few slaves, a few people had slaves, and it was legal to have slaves, but there was a really high support for staying in the Union. But however, a lot of people in Missouri, a lot of people in Maryland, a lot of people in Kentucky favored the South and wanted to be on the South side. And so Lincoln had to decide, what am I going to do with each of these states so that I can get them all into the Union, and then we'll be much more successful and much better off. And so Missouri, which is over here in the green, okay, Missouri had a lot of people wanted to join the South because they were a slave state and they kind of sympathized with the South. But the Union went in and set up their own government, okay, to try and stop that from happening. And then in Maryland, which is the other red one that's up right up here, okay, the other red one right up there, it's what they needed is they had to have Maryland. It was a really, really big deal to have Maryland because the United States capital was Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. is halfway between Virginia and Maryland. And so if you were stuck between Virginia and Maryland, and both Virginia and Maryland were part of the South, you kind of would be screwed if that was your capital. And so you had to have Maryland on your side. And so Lincoln decided for those two states he would send in troops, and he would use the troops in different laws, martial law, taking really, really strong control by having troops there. He'd keep those states by force, okay? And so before that point, before he sent in troops, people were destroying infrastructure, pulling up railroad tracks and destroying telegraph and telephone lines and just kind of ruining things and messing stuff up. And so he had to send in those troops, and that's how he kept Missouri and Maryland. But he also wanted to keep Kentucky because that was important. That was a border state too. That's that pink one right there. Okay, but Kentucky, they wanted to stay neutral. They didn't want to be part of this fight at all. They didn't want to fight against the South, but they didn't want to leave the North. And so their whole plan was just to stay neutral. And so Lincoln, of course, his generals wanted to go in. They wanted to go with the troops, just like they did in Missouri and Maryland, and take control of the situation. But he was afraid, Lincoln was afraid, that if he did this, the people of Kentucky might not like it because they're just trying to stay neutral and you're attacking them, and they may choose to secede and join the other side if you went in and attacked. And so Lincoln decided to stay away and just see what happens. But the South came in and they invaded. They invaded this state of Kentucky. And so what ended up happening is Kentucky got mad at the South who invaded and decided to pick the North to side with. And so Lincoln was right. Anybody who invaded was going to lose Kentucky to the other side. And so he made the right decision. Both sides had a lot of advantages in this war, but the South's advantages are these. Okay, in order to win the war, the North would have to invade the South and conquer it. Okay, the South, since they wanted to be their own country, they didn't want to take any land or anything like that. All they had to do was survive. They just had to make it through the battles, okay, and just keep on moving forward. And so a lot of the South's big advantages were that they were fighting in their own territory. So they knew the land better than their opponents. They knew the land better than North people because they were from that area. And also, if anybody was going to help them out, give them food, give them shelter, do whatever they could, okay, from the local area, they were going to help out the South. They were not going to help out the North because the people were from the South there. Okay, the other thing that was happening with the South, where they really had the advantage, is most of the experienced generals in the U.S. Army were from the South. And some of the best ones, Albert Johnston, Joseph Johnston, Robert E. Lee, they resigned. They gave up being in the U.S. Army, so they quit being in the U.S. Army so that they could go and fight for the South. And so the only generals with a whole lot of experience were the ones from the South, and so they had much better generals than the North did because they were more on the edge of the country. They were closer to Texas, they were closer to Mexico, where the last few wars had been happening. And so really the biggest advantages for the South were these huge military advantages, having better training, having a better idea of the land, not having to attack the North at all. They just had to survive. The North also had their advantages. One of the really, really big ones was that they had the most factories. Okay, and when you think about it, in 1861, the United States had 130,000 total factories. In the North, there were 110,000 factories. So that means in the North, 110,000 factories. The South, the whole South, only had 20,000 factories to total them up. So when it came to places to build bullets, build manufactured goods, create shoes, anything that's created in a factory, the North had basically all of it, and the South had very, very little. Okay. The other thing the North had more of, way more of, was the farmland and railroad tracks. It had 2 times as much farmland and 2 times as many miles of railroad tracks, and so that made it a lot easier for the troops in the North to move quickly, and many troops to move quickly on the railroads, and it also made it easier to feed the army because they had much larger farmland. The other thing, just a numbers game of an advantage in the South, was that almost all of the Americans lived in the North. 2/3 of all the Americans lived in the North. So it was 2/3 of America in the North versus 1/3 of all the people in America in the South. So they had way more people. And the other thing is that in the South, out of that 1/3 that was living in the South, 1/3 of them were slaves. And so really, you have 2/9 of the people left fighting against the entire rest of the country when you think the slaves were not allowed to fight. And so it was really a very big numbers advantage for the North. The North had way more people, and so therefore, if you have more people, you're going to have more soldiers, and because you have all of these factories, your factories are going to be able to make better weapons, and your additional farms are going to mean you have more supplies, and so you just have more soldiers and they have better equipment in general. And so the North thought they had a perfect strategy for a very quick win, and this is kind of what their strategy was, what their plan was. First off, they wanted to blockade, they wanted to put up a naval blockade, and so they wanted to get their ships out, and on this map here you can see they wanted to get their ships out and put them in important places along the coast of the South so that none of the ships could go into or out of the southern ports. And if they were blocking off all the southern ports, that meant that the South couldn't send out cotton to the people in Europe, so therefore they couldn't make any money off of it, so hurt the cotton exports, hurt their money, and it also cut off the other stuff from coming in. So their supplies to fight the war that would come in maybe from Europe couldn't make it in because the ships were blocking that. And their other plan, kind of part 2 of their plan, was to take over the Mississippi River. So send your ships up and take over this entire area, okay? And then if they could do that, they could cut off the South's major transportation link that would, connected the entire South all to each other, okay? And they could also essentially cut the South into 2 pieces, because Texas was part of the South, and it would have cut Texas away from it, and it would have cut a few other states that were part of the South away from the rest of the South and made them into, 2 separate fighting units that they had to defend, which would have been harder. Okay, and their last part of their plan that they thought would happen really quickly is they thought, we'll go in and we'll take over Richmond, Virginia, because Richmond, Virginia is a town that is only 100 miles away from Washington, D.C., and that is the Confederate capital. That's where the Confederate States of America decided to put their capital city. And so the 2 capitals of these fighting countries were only 100 miles away from each other. And so the North thought, well, we have so many troops, we'll go in, we'll take their capital away, we'll cut them off, and we'll get them to surrender. And the South's whole strategy was, all we have to do is defend ourselves until the North just gets sick of fighting and quits the war. So now we can talk about who the soldiers were. And what you need to really remember is that all of the soldiers in the Civil War were Americans. The people from the South, the people in the North, they were all Americans. And so it was a very strange war because there were people that knew each other before, some of them were in the same family, some of them were neighbors, some of them were friends, and now they had to fight against each other just because of this, where they couldn't get along with each other's ideals, with slavery and states' rights and all of these things. And so many people ran as quick as they could to the volunteer offices, volunteered to go to the war. One woman said from South Carolina, that all these men went running to the volunteer offices in fear that the war would be over before they got to see the fun. So it's kind of crazy. These people had this really weird perception of war where they thought, oh, this is going to be so much fun. I need to become a part of this. I need to be a hero. Okay, and so on both sides, people were rushing to the war offices. And so it turned out right away, about 3/4 of all the Southerners went to fight. And so 3/4 of all the Southerners was about 750,000 troops, many troops that the South had. However, in the North, 2/3 of all the people in the North came in and went and fought as well. And if you take 2/3 of that bigger number, you're going to have a very large number of troops. And so the North had about 1.2 million troops at the beginning of the war. And throughout the war, there was this crazy, like I said before, families fighting against each other and neighbors fighting against each other and all that kind of stuff. And one really good example of it is the First Lady of the United States, Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife. And she had 4 brothers, and all 4 of those brothers fought with the Confederacy. They were all part of the South. And so basically her 4 brothers all along were fighting against her husband. So kind of a weird family situation. And so what was it like to be a soldier? Well, most of the time they weren't fighting. They weren't actually fighting. So about 3/4 of their time was spent in camp. All right. And so that time in camp, what did they do? Well, they spent about 10 hours of training per day. Okay, and so 10 hours of training per day is a lot of time to be working on training. And so the rest of the time that they were awake was basically spent with standing guard, because all of them had short stints of guard duty on a daily basis, or at least every couple days. Okay, and then also surviving, gathering firewood, and even if they did get some time, a lot of the men decided to write home to their wives and families to let them know what was happening. And so most of their time was spent training and sleeping, really. And so there were all kinds of health threats, and people were dying not because of the actual fighting that was happening, but because of the disease that was happening within these camps. Inside of the camps, the biggest threat was not having clean water. There was not enough clean water, and so smallpox and typhoid fever were moving through the camps, through the tainted water to the men. And so it wasn't that strange to have like half of the entire regiment being too sick to fight when it came time to go to the battle. And so you would go to a battle, and if you didn't die, or if you didn't get back to camp, then you would be captured and put into a prison camp. And about 10% of the deaths in the Civil War happened in prison camps. They were not nice places to be. And so the first one we're going to talk about is Elmira, New York. And Elmira, New York was the North's biggest prison camp, and it was built to hold 5,000 Confederate soldier prisoners. Okay, and so, but the problem was eventually they got so many prisoners that they had to put in even more, and it got to the point where there were 10,000 prisoners holed up in this place that was built to only hold 5,000 prisoners. And so eventually they were running out of food for these people, and they cut it to where all they got to eat was bread and water. And so the prisoners, in order to survive, had to eat the rats that were running around inside of the prison just to survive, and many of these prisoners ended up dying. And there was an equally bad place in the South called Andersonville. And Andersonville prison, which was in Georgia, where they would keep Union prisoners, so the people from the North that had been captured and were prisoners, There were 35,000 people held in just an open field with a fence around it. So it was outdoors, just nothing there except for an open field. And so it got to the point where 100 people per day were dying from starvation and from exposure. So dying because they didn't have enough food or clean water to survive, because there were so many people stuck in this small area, or dying from exposure, which means exposure to the weather. It got too hot and people died because they overheated, or it got too cold and people froze to death as they were trying to sleep in the outdoors in Georgia in the winter. So the first Union general that was put in charge of everything by Abraham Lincoln was a man by the name of Irvin McDowell. And Irvin McDowell, and you can find his name in the back, make sure you're filling out the names in the back, was a Union general, and what he really wanted and really needed was he had these inexperienced soldiers and he wanted some time to get them ready, and so he was trying to train them as quickly as he could, but eventually the papers and the people and just everybody was frustrated by it, and they wanted the war to be over, and so they demanded that he go down and capture Richmond. And so Irvin McDowell set out with his troops to go down and do just that, to capture Richmond and try and end the war quickly. And so his 30,000 troops that he had ready and felt were ready marched from Washington, D.C. towards Richmond, Virginia. And about 25 miles into his march, they met up with an about equal-sized force, about 30,000 Confederate troops at Manassas. And so at the same time, marching along with them were hundreds of families that rode on horseback, and they set up on top of a hill to watch this battle, because they had this idea that they would watch a quick North victory and it would be heroic and it would be neat and all that kind of stuff. Boy, were they in for something nasty, because war is a bloody, horrible thing, and all of these, families and women and kids and everything had to watch this happening. It was just terrible. But they ended up meeting near Manassas at a river called Bull Run. It was just north of Manassas. Okay, and so the two armies lined up against each other, and they were ready to go, and the Union Army started to push, and they were able to completely push back the Confederates, and they had the Confederates backing up and backing up and backing up, and it looked like, oh my, well, they're going to win, and they will take Richmond, and the war will be over very, very quick. But then, as the Southern troops were being pushed back, they looked over and they saw one area of the line was not being pushed back. And so they're all scared, and they're thinking, uh-oh, we better start running. We're not going to win this. This is going to be terrible. And they look over and they see one group of men who are fighting, and they're not moving at all. And so they look over and they notice, oh my gosh, that's the group of Virginians, and those Virginians we know are being led by this commander named Jackson, okay, Thomas Jackson. And one of the troops yelled out, "Look over there! Look, there's Jackson with his Virginians standing like a stone wall." And that gave all of the other Confederates the bravery to stand their ground and fight back. Okay, and so Thomas Jackson forever would have the nickname Stonewall Jackson, and that is what he's famous for. A commander from the South that was able to get those troops to turn around and really put up a good fight against the North. Okay, and so so the battle behind Stonewall Jackson and the other men started to turn, and the Confederates started to get the upper hand, and they started to push the Union soldiers back. The Union soldiers didn't have a Stonewall Jackson to give them strength and to give them bravery, and so they turned around and ran, because they didn't have very good experience and they weren't prepared, and they really needed more training. And so they ran away as quick as they could, and of course, when there's a retreating army, if the other army attacks it, then they can completely dominate that army. They can kill most of them or take them and put them in prison. However, at this point, after this first battle, the Confederates were way too exhausted, way too tired to run after them, to give chase and rout the Union forces. And so we realized this was really the first point where the North realized this is not going to be a fast war. This is not going to be easy. It is going to be a long and brutal war. Before the Civil War, the main strategy for winning a war was all about this just all out charge. And what they would do is they would put these bayonets on the end of their guns, which a bayonet is like a knife that attaches the end of the gun, and they would just rush the other people and attack them as quickly as possible and get the other side scared and overwhelmed by how many people you sent after them. And so that was the main plan, and that was how you won wars back in the day before the Civil War. But in the Civil War, they had these new technologies that were making that not a good strategy anymore. They had rifles and cannons. Before, all they had was muskets and artillery. And so muskets and artillery basically shot these round balls that didn't have any accuracy, but rifles and cannons instead shot projectiles out of a rifled barrel, which that rifled barrel spins the bullet. Remember, we talked about spinning the bullet like it's a football with a spiral, and makes it way more accurate, makes it go way further. Okay, and so what was happening is if these men decided to charge across, which that was what the generals were taught to do, then they would just be gunned down by these very, very accurate guns. And the other thing is now these guns, because they had made bullets with a gunpowder and all that kind of stuff attached already, they could be reloaded way, way faster. Instead of it taking 2 minutes to reload the gun, you could reload it, maybe 4 or 5 times in a minute. And so you were shooting way more bullets, and it just wasn't useful to charge across. However, the generals didn't know that, and so it took them a really long time to change their tactics. And so most of the war, a lot of people died because they didn't have good tactics for the new kind of warfare that was happening. So thousands of people were slaughtered by just following their orders and running across an open field at the other side. The other new technology that was happening is they had these ironclads, these ships that were completely covered in metal. And so the most famous battle between two ironclads, which ended up in a draw and nobody ended up winning, was between the Merrimack, which was for the south, okay, and the Monitor, which is for the north. And the picture of the Merrimack is right here on top, and the picture of the Monitor is right down here. Okay, and these two ships ended up fighting for a long time before they both just kind of gave up because they couldn't beat each other. But the ironclads were used really, really well by both sides. The Confederates used the ironclads against the blockade. They were able to blow holes into the blockade and get some supplies through from England to get cotton out. And the Union used it really well to control the Mississippi River, which was really important to their plan. And so the interesting thing about the ironclads is these metal ships kind of marked the beginning of the end for the old wooden ships. So because the troops had failed under McDowell, Irwin McDowell got fired, and the next general that was put in charge by Abraham Lincoln was a man named George McClellan. George McClellan was a fancy guy. He was very rich. He wore these beautifully tailored and fitted suits and was just always, never a wrinkle in them. He was very, very organized all the time. And he was an excellent organizer, he really was, but he was way, way too cautious. He was extremely cautious. And so he trained his troops, and he trained his troops, and he trained his troops, and they needed the training, so he just kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And after 7 months of training and not a single attack on anybody in the South, Abraham Lincoln kind of was making a joke, and he said, you know what, well, if McClellan's not going to use if General McClellan does not want to use his army, I would like to borrow them for a time. Basically saying, let's get going, let's do something about this. We can't just sit here and train forever, because while we're training, the South is training too and getting better. And so almost a year after George McClellan was put in charge, almost a year after that previous battle, he finally decided to make a move. And what McClellan did is he got his men onto ships, and he went to the southeast of Richmond so that he could attack from a different angle, not attack from the north where they were expecting, but attack from the southeast. And so he took with him 100,000 soldiers. And while he was taking these 100,000 soldiers, he ended up finding out through his scouts who were looking out and checking the other side, checking the South, that the South only had 15,000 troops standing in his way, and he could have gotten to Richmond if his 100,000 could just beat those 15,000, right? So he had basically, I mean, it's not quite, but it's almost 10 men for every South, or every man from the South. But Lincoln had insisted when McClellan left that he kept 37,000 troops behind in Washington, D.C. in case the South decided to attack, so he at least had some troops to defend his capital. So McClellan, he wanted those 37,000 troops. He wanted to be absolutely sure that he beat those 15,000 troops and got to Richmond and won. And so he stopped, and he demanded that Lincoln sent him reinforcements. And he ended up waiting for a month. And Lincoln said, no, we need somebody to defend our capital no matter what you want. If you have 100,000 and they have 15,000, then you should fight them and you should win and get moving. Well, he waited an entire month, and during that month, the Confederates had gotten reinforcements, and they had made their army a lot bigger. And so when the Union Army finally attacked, they were stopped, and the Confederate Army forced the Union Army to retreat. So it was a big, big loss because McClellan was too scared to attack with those 100,000 troops and demanded that Lincoln send him more. And so now with the South winning so much, you would think the South, well, maybe they did win the war. I don't know what happened. Okay, but and so you have to think, well, if we know the North won the war, at some point it had to turn back the other way. And the point where it turned back and there was payback was Robert E. Lee got a little bit too bold. And so Robert E. Lee, remember, is that Confederate general. He's the main general of the South. And he decided, you know what, we've been winning, and we've been winning pretty easily against these guys, and we've been kind of dominating these two battles that we've had. And so he thought, we need to attack the North, because if we can win even a small battle against the North in the North's land, then we can get support from Europe, and we can make the people in the North more sick of the war, because if we're fighting on their land and their land's getting destroyed, they're going to be tired of it. So he decided to invade the western part of Maryland. And he went in and he had a plan. Now, the kind of lucky thing for McClellan is that one of his men found a piece of paper laying around on the ground from where the South had left, and that piece of paper had Lee's entire plan on it, and it showed him, and he learned that Lee's army was going to split and exactly where they were going to go. And so the Union was ready to fight against the bigger part of Robert E. Lee's army when they reached Antietam Creek. Okay, and Antietam Creek it's a river, but it's where the battle took place. And so the Battle of Antietam happened on September 17th, 1862, when the Union troops decided to attack that larger part of the Confederate army. This was a huge battle, okay, and McClellan just kept sending his troops and sending his troops and sending his troops and sending his troops at Robert E. Lee. And it was the single bloodiest day, September 17th, of the entire Civil War, the worst one-day battle of the entire Civil War. In one day, 12,000 Union and 14,000 Confederate troops were seen as casualties. And casualties are people that were killed, injured, or missing in the battle. And so that means 26,000 Americans were killed or injured on that day. 12,000 of them from the North and 14,000 of them from the South. And Robert E. Lee eventually had to order a retreat and go back down to the South. McClellan did not run after him, which Lincoln was very mad about. He wished that McClellan would have attacked and kind of taken out Lee once and for all, but he didn't. And so really what ended up happening is neither side really won, but the South retreated, and so the North said, oh, we won a great victory. And so they finally got to feel what it felt like to win a battle. And so while the armies on the east side of America were being very cautious and not moving very much at all, the armies on the west side were on the attack. And kind of the most successful general of one of these armies was Ulysses S. Grant. And this is a picture of Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, Ulysses S. Grant is a whole different guy than McClellan, complete opposite of McClellan. He was a poor teller's son, just a person who, ran the cash register at the local shop. He was the son of one of those people. And so he had rumpled clothes. He didn't care what he looked like. He didn't have the nicely fitted suits and all that kind of stuff. And he took chances, where McClellan was so organized and would never take a chance and too cautious. Ulysses S. Grant was willing to take chances and was willing to lose some troops to win the battle. And so he advanced south, starting in Kentucky, and moved down towards Tennessee. And when he did this, he first was able to take over Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. And Fort Henry and Fort Donelson were both on these very, very important water routes, including, right along the Mississippi River. And so what it did, by taking over Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, he opened these water routes into the south. So now the troops from the north could move very quickly on ships into the south. And they could also use the North could also use their better ships to help out in the battle. And so pushing on from Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, Grant decided that he wanted to take the railroad center in Corinth. And so he decided to start marching his people towards this railroad center in the city of Corinth. And at Shiloh Creek, right outside of Corinth, the Confederates decided to attack the Union to keep them from getting to that railroad center. And so as the Confederates attacked, Ulysses S. Grant just sent wave after wave after wave of his troops at the south. He knew he had way more troops in the south, and so he could just keep sending his troops, as many as he would, and eventually the South would run out before he did. And so it ended up with 11,000 casualties. Remember, that word is deaths and injuries for the South, and 13,000 casualties for the North. So the South won, right? The South had less casualties. More people were hurt and killed for the North. But that's not what happened, because, like I said, Grant knew that he could lose more men and still win the battle, and that's what happened, because eventually the South was running out of troops, and they had to retreat, and they had to withdraw from the railroad center, and Ulysses S. Grant was able to take over the railroad center at Corinth. And so at this point, within, a few months, he controlled most of Tennessee and almost the entire northern part of the Mississippi River. So he was extremely successful in the west, while McClellan was having trouble in the east. And the last man we're going to talk about today, you'll find again in the back in your glossary of names, make sure you're getting that filled in, is David Farragut. And David Farragut was a Union fleet commander, so he was in charge of the ships of the Union. And what him and his ships did is they came around through the Gulf of Mexico all the way around America and went to where the Gulf of Mexico meets the Mississippi River, which, remember, that Mississippi River was a big part of the North's plan, and attacked at that city. And that city is New Orleans, where those two bodies of water meet each other. And so on April 26th, he captured New Orleans. And by the end of summer, he basically owned the entire south part of the Mississippi River. And remember, if Ulysses S. Grant has the north part and he has the south part, the North owns almost the entire Mississippi River. And so that was a pretty big advantage for them. However, if we look at it overall, really nobody's winning yet. Nobody has taken out the other one's capital. No one has even really gotten very close to doing that. Every time that one group attacks in the east, which is the more important side of the war, the defender just keeps winning. And so really, in the east, the South was winning the war. But out in the west and on the oceans, the North was definitely winning. And so at this point in the war, nobody really had a decisive advantage. There was nobody who was for sure going to win at this point. It was still kind of up in the air. So in the next presentation, we'll learn what happened to end the war.